I'm just dwelling on the many talents of Chris Estes. Chris is not only leading worship today as part of the Charismaniacs, he's also our pastor of recovery ministries here in this worshiping community. He leads and organizes a lot of 12-step meetings that happen here throughout the week for folks who are looking for refuge and a place of safety in their time of need and trouble. So we're thankful for Chris. We're also especially thankful for Chris's word last week. Chris preached last week on Psalm 30 and had to rewrite his message over the weekend in light of the tragic circumstances that happened in the Hill Country and all around Central Texas. So I just stand amazed in the presence of Chris Estes, the Nazarene. No, he's not from Nazareth. He's from upstate New York, which I'm sure is a lot like Nazareth. All right, enough dwelling on that. Have you ever heard the phrase, it's a marathon, not a sprint? I'm sure somebody has told you that along the way when you were eager to get something done, or maybe rushing through your homework, through a task, whatever it is. It's a marathon, not a sprint. That refrain, that mantra became real for me a few years ago when I was actually training to be in a race. I signed up for a race here in San Antonio, and I had to put in the work in order to be prepared for race day so I wouldn't pass out or make a fool of myself. I know you're all surprised that I'm not a football player by my body build, but I had not done competitive racing. It wasn't even competitive. It was just an organized race. But I was determined to not look like a fool, and so I put in the effort. And one of the things that became apparent to me, a lesson that I was taught over and over by the program that I was following to train for the race, a lesson that is obvious but is one of the hardest to implement, is this. You do your slowest running at the beginning of any run. You do your slowest running at the beginning of any run. Now, I know that seems mentally like that works together, but just think about it. When you go out for a run, whether it's early in the morning or maybe it's during your day or maybe it is race day, the big day you've been planning and working toward, you have your most energy at the very beginning of the race. If you're on the starting line of the organized race, you have a lot of adrenaline going and excitement as you see the people around you and you hear the music and then you hear the horn go off or they just tell you to go. At that point, you have to do your slowest running. It takes everything in you not to just go out sprinting. Now, for me, I like to run early in the morning when nobody is out. There's no cars and it's not 100 degrees, although it hasn't been 100 degrees so far in this summer. But I like to go early in the morning when I run. And while I'm still waking up, it's after a night of sleep and recovery and rest. And so when I start going, I still have to tell myself to take it easy, to pace myself. I have to force myself to go slowly. Because the last thing you want, whether it's in a race or on any run, is to get into the middle of your run and realize that you have nothing left to give, that all the gas has been spent and there's nothing left in the tank, that you can't complete what you set out to start. You have to force yourself to go slowly at the very beginning. Now, we've been in the Psalms the past few weeks here at Alamo Heights UMC. We've heard some fantastic expositions and explanations of what the Psalms are all about, these collection of prayers and songs and poems addressed to God from God's people. And we talked about how while much of Scripture is words about God, the Psalms have a unique position in that they are words to God. Words that we can take up, words that are trustworthy and meaningful, even sometimes unvarnished and ugly, but words nonetheless that are collected for our sakes that we can incorporate into our own practice of life with God. And so we've been looking at all kinds of Psalms, all kinds of ways that we can show up in conversation and relationship with the divine. And I wonder if you've heard this familiar phrase before from Psalm 46, "Be still and know that I am God." Did your grandparents have it needle-pointed in their living room? Has somebody said it to you when you're stressed out at work or in school? Maybe you've said it as your own centering phrase during a time of contemplative prayer or meditation. However we use it, we might be familiar with the phrase, but we might be less familiar with the psalm in which it is situated. Psalm 46. Did you hear those opening lines? Did they sound anything like the peace that verse is promising us? The opening lines are about cataclysmic chaos in creation. Then it goes into political turmoil. The nations are in an uproar. The kingdoms totter. And then God shows up and it says, behold the desolations that God has wrought. And then we get to, of course, be still and know that I am God. Funny, isn't it, that such a verse is situated in this kind of prayer, this kind of poem and song. A lot of scholars believe that this psalm might have originated in the time when Jerusalem was facing invasion from the Assyrian Empire, right around the year 700 BCE. King Sennacherib, who was the leader of the Assyrians, had just wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel, exiled all the people across the Assyrian Empire, and then he came for the southern kingdom, Judah. And he shows up at the gates of Jerusalem, and then miraculously, Jerusalem is spared. And there's conflicting stories about why that is. But can you imagine praying this prayer, Psalm 46, looking over the city walls and seeing the Assyrian Empire, known for their cruelty against their enemies? Can you imagine saying the words, be still and know that I am God, as you face certain death at the hands of somebody who hates you? Interesting, isn't it, that these words come from this psalm? What about when we face disaster, calamity, chaos? Is our first reaction, our first instinct to go, be still? Don't worry. You're not God. The past 10 days, we've seen quite a bit of disaster and tragedy here in our community. People in our own church that we named at the very beginning of the service who have suffered loss of children and grandchildren. Many people who have lost or are missing extended relatives who have not yet been found connected to Alamo Heights UMC. People here who might have had property or businesses, relationships of any kind along the Guadalupe River or the San Gabriel River, all across Central Texas, who are picking up the pieces. We've seen unimaginable devastation hit us. And yet in the past 10 days, we've seen an equal amount of relief and response. We've seen people turn out from everywhere, pouring out their love and support for folks who are trying to put it all back together and recover what has been lost, if it even can be recovered. I've had people from Houston, people from South Carolina, people from North Carolina all reach out to me personally saying, where can I send my money? Who can I pray for? How can I help? Have you had a conversation this week with the words, I wonder how I can help? I wonder what I can do? I know if you went to our website, you saw tangible ways to be of relief and response, but all of us are wondering, what else can we do? Particularly those of us who have not been directly impacted by the flood. We've had to watch people we love, neighbors that we know, or maybe just faces on the news, people that we have some compassion for. We've all been wondering as we're on the outside looking in, what difference can we make? Reading this psalm at this time is interesting. It seems to me, according to the psalmist, Psalm 46, that the first response suggested is to be still. That wouldn't be my first reaction. Would it be yours? I want to jump into action. I'm ready to do something. I'm ready to respond and react with the speed and the force of an Olympic sprinter. I want to get after it. I want people to know they're not alone, that they don't have to face this by themselves. I'm ready to hand out things. I'm ready to get out there and start cleaning up the muck. And yet the psalmist says, be still. I wonder if there's some wisdom here for us. I wonder if we can listen to the words of this prayer and learn something that's helpful, particularly for those of us who are wondering what we can do to help our neighbors. What's a healthy, faithful way to show up as a presence of blessing and support to those in their time of need? I've had conversations throughout the week about Psalm 46 and about the situation that we find ourselves in. And people who are wiser than me, people who are in the 12-step traditions that exist around Alamo Heights, have pointed me to this interesting perspective. They said, when we have this impulse, when we have this adrenaline or maybe even anxiety rise up in us and we want to do something in response, we should pause. We should take note of that feeling that's welling up in our spirits. And we should examine it. We should wonder why we're being driven to react and respond so suddenly, with so much force. More often than not, these friends of mine have said, the feeling underneath our reaction and our compulsion, that feeling is fear. Fear can cause us to lash out in a helpful way, but lash out nonetheless. Fear that we don't have control as we see sudden devastation that we cannot stop. Fear that we may not have the right answers for people who are asking the hard questions, like how could a God of love allow this to happen? Fear of the finite nature of life. As we see people that we know grieving the loss of loved ones, and we suddenly get in touch with our own mortality and realize that death is not all that far away, not as far as we thought. Fear can underlie so much of our reaction and response. And instead of sitting with that fear, examining it, perhaps confronting it, we skip over the stillness. We skip over the examination. We go straight into getting busy, to getting work done, to doing something, instead of recognizing what's happening within us. I came across a phrase earlier this week on a podcast that somebody in the 12-step tradition said, oh yeah, we use it all the time. And it made me realize that I should probably go to a meeting at some point. This phrase is called spiritual bypassing. Have you heard of this phrase? It's a psychological term that's used that was coined a couple decades ago by somebody who was a practicing Buddhist, but also a psychologist. And this man noticed that people were using spiritual ideas and practices to avoid confronting emotional wounds or unaddressed developmental stages or even psychological trauma. So, if they were anxious, they might just get a word like, you need to pray more. If you prayed more, you wouldn't be anxious. Or maybe they were saying that to themselves. Maybe they would go to people who were grieving the loss of a loved one and they would say, you know, all things work together for good for those who love God. God needed another angel in heaven. Everything happens for a reason. All of these are shortcuts. Ways that we work around the pain that we are so afraid to address, the fear that is in our hearts. Instead, we short circuit it. We have an easy fix, a quick answer, an effective solution in the short term that in the long term leads us worse off than before. Spiritual bypassing. Anne Lamott, the famous writer, puts it this way. She says that help is often the sunny side of control. Help is often the sunny side of control. When we want to help people, that's when we know that we have the reins in our hands. To be at a loss, to be empty-handed, to be in need ourselves is the place where we don't want to be. Now, our assigned gospel text for this Sunday from the church calendar is the parable of the Good Samaritan, the story that Becca read, the story that Jesus tells to the expert in the law. And I wonder if you've heard this story before, and you know that last line that Jesus says, go and do likewise. This is a parable that is leading us to behave a certain way. And oftentimes, we say that phrase, what would Jesus do? And so we hear the parable as a call to action, and then we picture what Jesus would do, and then we think pretty quickly, Jesus is the Good Samaritan, and he helps people who are in need. Therefore, I ought to be like Jesus. I ought to go help somebody. I ought to go make the mess better, fix the problem. I came across an interesting interpretation from a pastor and a New Testament scholar this week. His name's David Harvey, and he's in Calgary. And David Harvey had this take on the Good Samaritan. He said, what if instead of picturing Jesus as the Good Samaritan in the story, we pictured Jesus as the victim who needed assistance, the person who was left for dead that needed somebody to help him? What would it look like in that situation to say, what would Jesus do? Here's David Harvey's reasoning. If Christ is the Good Samaritan, it allows us to effortlessly jump to the conclusion that Christ is calling us to help, to fix, to sort out. Regardless of whether or not we are any good at these things, we like the idea that we think these are the things we should do. This reading of the parable with Jesus as the Good Samaritan and us to follow in his footsteps, it activates within us a kind of Savior complex, which is then boosted into a Jesus imitating Savior complex. And if we're not careful, we fall into the trap that Anne Lamott so wisely laid out before us, that help is the sunny side of control. If Jesus is the one left for dead, then it's not about doing things for people. If Jesus is the one in the parable who's left for dead, it's not about doing things for people. It's about being with those who are suffering, being in their presence, and not leaving their side. It's about holding space, as Reverend Estes so wisely told us last week. When we want to help, when we want to fix, when we want to sort out, we quickly get into doing mode. We do for, we donate flood buckets, we give money, we show up and we clean out houses. All of that is great. But do we take time to stop? To stop and wonder who these people are? What's going on inside of us? How these people who are suffering might reveal something to us about the Christ that is present and calling us to be together. Friends, it's a marathon, not a sprint. We have to choose intentionally in a moment like this, at the very beginning of response, 10 days in, we have to choose to slow ourselves down, to manage our pace, perhaps into the speed of love. The speed of love doesn't rush by people in order to do things for them. It sits with them. It not only provides hospitality, but receives the hospitality of those who are suffering. The speed of love takes time to practice stillness, to ask the hard questions, not only like, why did this occur, but why am I responding this way? What's going on inside of me? Where am I invited to show up and be a faithful presence? And where am I elbowing my way into the center of the story so that I can feel good? The speed of love allows us to see that we don't always have to be the hero of every story. We can be a quiet presence, a few circles out, providing support where we're called upon, and choosing to do the simple things like being with. I've also had questions from folks who might feel guilty about just showing up and sitting with somebody who's having a hard time, or having lunch with somebody who's going through it, who's suffered because of this tragedy. And I would encourage you that that indeed is the speed of love, to be with, not to rush past and merely do for. Doing for is great. Being with is the way that God chooses to relate to us. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And if we're being honest, we know the sad reality is that though we're 10 days in, pretty soon, most of the help will fade away. People will go back to what they were doing before. There will be another news story that catches our attention and rises our anxiety. And the people in Central Texas will continue to be suffering. We do not want to be like those who leave as quickly as they come, particularly for those in our church community who are with us. We don't want their pain to become invisible and unnoticed because we've become too distracted with doing things for others. We want to be with them every single step of the way.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time